In the skies over Europe during the Second World War, German fighter pilots believed they understood every enemy aircraft they faced. They knew which planes could outclimb them, which could outturn them, and which ones could be outrun or destroyed with disciplined tactics. By 1943, Luftwaffe aces had fought Spitfires, Hurricanes, P-40s, and even the rugged P-47 Thunderbolt. They thought they had learned all the lessons there were to learn, but one American aircraft quietly shattered one of their most trusted assumptions, the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. At first glance, the P-38 looked strange, even awkward. Twin booms, a central cockpit pod, long wings, and an unmistakable silhouette that made it impossible to confuse with any other fighter in the war. German pilots called it der Gabelschwanz, the fork-tailed devil. Early encounters did not inspire fear. In fact, many Luftwaffe pilots believed the P-38 was inferior in a dogfight. It was large, heavier than single-engine fighters, and seemed less agile than the nimble Messerschmitt Bf-109 or the feared Focke-Wulf FW-190. What the Germans did not know, what they could not yet know, was that American engineers had quietly solved a problem that plagued high-speed fighters on both sides of the war. A problem so dangerous that pilots often died without understanding what had killed them. The problem was compressibility. As aircraft approached very high speeds in a dive, especially near the speed of sound, airflow over parts of the wing would begin to behave unpredictably. Control surfaces stiffened, elevator response disappeared. The aircraft would tuck its nose down, diving steeper and steeper, while the pilot pulled back helplessly on the controls. Many pilots never recovered. The ground rushed up faster than human reaction could respond. German pilots knew this danger well. Messerschmitt and Focke-Wulf fighters were fast, but they had limits. If a dive became too steep, recovery could be impossible. Luftwaffe doctrine taught pilots to respect these limits. Speed was a weapon, but only up to a point. Early in the war, the P-38 suffered from the same problem. American pilots reported terrifying dives where the aircraft refused to pull out. Several were killed. For a time, the P-38's reputation suffered, especially in Europe. German intelligence reports noted these incidents and concluded that the Lightning was vulnerable at high speed. It seemed logical. All fighters were. But behind the scenes, Lockheed engineers were working on a solution. Not a weapon, not armor, not more horsepower. A small mechanical system that would quietly change the rules of aerial combat. Dive recovery flaps. Installed beneath the wings, these flaps could be deployed during high-speed dives. They altered airflow just enough to restore elevator authority, allowing the pilot to pull out safely from dives that would otherwise be fatal. The system was simple in concept, revolutionary in effect. The Germans never anticipated this. By late 1943 and into 1944, Luftwaffe pilots began encountering a new and deeply unsettling reality. P-38s were no longer avoiding steep dives, they were using them aggressively. In combat reports, German pilots described American fighters diving away at impossible speeds, pulling out smoothly, then climbing back into the fight. What they were seeing contradicted everything they knew about physics, aircraft limits, and their own experience. One German ace described chasing a Lightning in a vertical dive, convinced the American pilot had made a fatal mistake. The Messerschmitt followed, speed increasing, the airframe beginning to shudder. At the last moment, the P-38 pulled up cleanly and leveled out. The German pilot could not follow. He was forced to break off, shaken and confused. To the Luftwaffe, this was deeply alarming. German fighters were designed around precision and performance at medium altitudes. Their doctrine emphasized climb rate, acceleration, and disciplined energy fighting. But now they were encountering an aircraft that could dive deeper, faster, and recover when German fighters could not. The advantage they believed was theirs, the ability to control vertical combat, was slipping away. Worse still, German pilots did not understand why. Intelligence officers examined wreckage where possible. Reports were filed. But the dive recovery flaps were not obvious weapons. They did not look dramatic. They did not announce themselves. And American pilots were not advertising their existence. The P-38 simply began doing things the Germans believed were impossible. This misunderstanding cost the Luftwaffe dearly. By 1944, American escort fighters were pushing deeper into Germany. Bomber formations reached targets once considered untouchable. The P-38 played a crucial role, especially at long range, where its twin engines offered reliability over hostile territory. If one engine failed, the aircraft could still bring its pilot home. This alone made the Lightning valuable. But now, with dive recovery flaps, it became deadly. German pilots who attempted to use traditional counter tactics found themselves at a disadvantage. They could not rely on diving escape. They could not assume an American fighter would lose control at extreme speeds. In combat, assumptions kill faster than bullets. As losses mounted, morale suffered. Luftwaffe veterans who had survived years of combat sensed something had changed. The sky no longer behaved the way it used to. The Americans were not just bringing more planes, they were bringing better solutions. The P-38 was not perfect. It was still large. It still required skill to fly well. In inexperienced hands, it could be unforgiving. But in the hands of trained pilots, supported by engineering innovation, it became a silent advantage the Germans never fully countered. And perhaps most importantly, it revealed a deeper truth about the air war. Victory was no longer decided only by pilot skill or raw engine power. It was decided by engineering details, by small systems hidden beneath wings that changed how an aircraft behaved at the edge of physics. The Germans had world-class engineers, but in this case, they were reacting, not leading. By the time the Luftwaffe realized what the P-38 could truly do, the balance of the air war had already shifted. Fuel shortages crippled training. Veteran pilots were gone. Replacement pilots faced enemies who could dive faster, recover safer, and dictate when to fight and when to disappear. The fork-tailed devil had earned its name. And this was only the beginning of what German pilots would face as the Allies tightened their grip over the skies of Europe. By the time German commanders began to recognize that something was fundamentally different about the P-38, the war in the air had already entered a new phase. The Luftwaffe was no longer fighting for air superiority, it was fighting for survival. And survival demanded that old habits, once reliable, now be questioned under brutal combat pressure. German pilots had always trusted the Messerschmitt. The Bf-109 was fast, climbed well, and responded sharply to control inputs. It rewarded aggression and punished hesitation. But it was designed in an era when aircraft were not expected to operate safely near the limits of compressibility. As speeds increased late in the war, those limits became unforgiving. When a German pilot pushed his aircraft into a steep dive, he was gambling. The deeper the dive, the more likely control forces would stiffen. Recovery required altitude, anticipation, and luck. Many pilots learned this lesson the hard way. Some never lived to report it. The P-38 began rewriting those rules in combat. American pilots quickly learned that the dive recovery flaps gave them something their enemies lacked: confidence. Confidence not just in speed, but in escape. A P-38 pilot could commit to a dive knowing he had a way out. That single psychological advantage altered behavior in combat. German pilots noticed the change almost immediately. In early encounters, Luftwaffe pilots would dive aggressively to disengage or lure American fighters downward. Against P-47s or earlier Allied aircraft, this tactic often worked, but when used against the Lightning, it failed. Again and again, German pilots found themselves unable to shake their pursuers or follow theirs safely. Combat reports described American fighters diving straight through flak layers, pulling out at altitudes where German pilots would have already lost control. Some Luftwaffe pilots believed the Americans were reckless or suicidal. Others suspected experimental aircraft or secret modifications. Few understood the true reason. The result was hesitation. Hesitation in air combat is lethal. German pilots began avoiding steep dives entirely when P-38s were present. This narrowed their tactical options. Vertical maneuvers became dangerous, escape paths shrank, and when pilots feel trapped, mistakes multiply. The Luftwaffe attempted adjustments. Pilots were instructed to avoid prolonged dives. Engagements were to be kept horizontal where possible. But this played directly into Allied hands. American fighters now controlled when and how combat happened. Meanwhile, American doctrine evolved rapidly. P-38 units emphasized energy fighting: dive, strike, climb, disengage. The Lightning's long range allowed it to stay with bombers deep into enemy territory, and its dive performance meant it could attack and withdraw repeatedly without committing to turning dogfights. German bomber interceptors found themselves increasingly exposed. The P-38 was especially effective against German reconnaissance aircraft and twin-engine bombers. Its concentrated nose-mounted armament allowed accurate fire at range. Combined with its dive capability, it could strike quickly and escape before escorts could respond. For German pilots, frustration turned into fear. Veterans who once felt dominant now felt hunted. The sky, once familiar, had become unpredictable. Reports from different fronts echoed the same theme. American aircraft were diving away and returning at will. German tactics no longer dictated the fight. At the command level, the problem was deeper than one aircraft. Germany lacked the fuel to train new pilots adequately. Young pilots were rushed into combat with minimal flight hours. They faced enemies flying machines that forgave mistakes and rewarded boldness. German aircraft demanded precision but offered no margin for error. Dive recovery flaps represented more than a technical advantage. They symbolized a shift in industrial philosophy. Engineers anticipated pilot limitations and built systems to protect them. German designs assumed elite pilots who would never exceed limits. By 1944, Germany no longer had enough elite pilots to sustain that assumption. The consequences were brutal. Loss rates increased. Replacement pilots died quickly. Veteran pilots were worn down by constant combat and dwindling support. Airfields were bombed. Fuel deliveries were interrupted. Aircraft sat grounded while Allied fighters roamed freely overhead. And the P-38 kept appearing. In some regions, German pilots reported that Lightnings operated at altitudes and speeds that made interception nearly impossible. Attempts to climb above them wasted fuel. Attempts to dive below them ended in failure. The Lightning could choose when to fight and when to disappear. Psychologically, this was devastating. The Luftwaffe had once prided itself on tactical mastery. Now it was reacting instead of initiating. German pilots felt the initiative slipping from their hands with every engagement. Even when German fighters scored victories, losses mounted faster. The attrition favored the Allies. For every experienced German pilot lost, there was no equivalent replacement. For every American pilot lost, another trained aviator took his place. The dive recovery flaps did not win the war alone, but they removed one of the Luftwaffe's last reliable advantages, the belief that physics itself would limit the enemy. By late 1944, German pilots understood something had gone wrong, even if they could not articulate it. They were fighting an enemy that seemed to ignore the rules. Aircraft no longer behaved as expected. Speed was no longer a shared boundary. In the cold skies over Germany, the fork-tailed silhouette meant a warning sign. It meant escort fighters that would not break off. It meant dives that could not be followed. It meant survival was no longer guaranteed by skill alone. And as the war moved closer to German cities, factories, and homes, the consequences of that realization became impossible to ignore. The air war was no longer about bravery or tradition. It was about systems, engineering, and endurance. And in that kind of war, the P-38 Lightning arrived with an advantage the Germans never saw coming. The Messerschmitt pilots who survived into 1944 would later say there was a moment in the air war when the rules they had trusted simply stopped working. And part of that moment came whenever a P-38 Lightning rolled over, pointed its nose straight down, and did not die the way German experience said it should. By this stage of the war, the Luftwaffe had already lost many of its best veterans. Fuel shortages meant new pilots trained fewer hours, tactics had become defensive, and morale was under constant pressure from endless Allied bombing. Yet, even in this weakened state, German fighter doctrine still relied on one belief drilled into pilots from their first training flights. German fighters could dive faster, recover better, and use gravity as a weapon. This belief had been true early in the war. The Bf-109 and Fw-190 had outdived Spitfires, Hurricanes, and many earlier Allied designs. A dive was safety, escape, and sometimes victory. But the P-38 was not like those earlier Allied fighters, and the dive recovery flaps would quietly turn German assumptions into deadly mistakes. To understand why this shocked German pilots, you have to understand how dangerous high-speed dives were in the early 1940s. At very high speeds, especially near what pilots called compressibility, air flowing over the wings would change behavior. Control surfaces became heavy or even useless. Many aircraft would tuck their noses down harder as speed increased, making recovery nearly impossible. Several fighters had been lost not to enemy fire, but to pilots who simply could not pull out of a dive. German engineers understood this problem well, but their solution was often structural strength and pilot discipline rather than aerodynamic innovation. German pilots were taught limits: do not exceed certain speeds, do not chase too steeply, and if necessary, rely on the aircraft's strong construction to survive. Against most Allied fighters, this worked. The P-38, however, was born from a different design philosophy. It was heavy, twin-engined, long-ranged, and built for high-altitude performance. Early in its service, American pilots struggled with the same compressibility problems. Several P-38s were lost when pilots entered steep dives and could not recover. Instead of accepting this as an unavoidable danger, American engineers searched for a solution. The result was the dive recovery flap, a relatively simple but revolutionary idea. Small flaps installed beneath the wings could be deployed during high-speed dives, changing the airflow and allowing the pilot to regain control. It was not glamorous and it did not make headlines, but it changed combat in ways German pilots did not anticipate. By the time large numbers of P-38s were operating over Europe, especially escorting bombers and conducting long-range fighter sweeps, many German pilots still thought of the Lightning as a strange but limited opponent. It was big, it had a large silhouette, and it did not turn as tightly as a Bf-109. Experienced German aces believed they knew how to deal with it. The standard tactic was simple: force the P-38 into a dive, follow it down, and either escape or attack once the American pilot lost control. This tactic had worked before against other Allied fighters. What they did not know was that the rules had changed. Accounts from Luftwaffe pilots describe encounters where a P-38 would break away from combat and dive almost vertically. Confident German pilots would push their noses down and follow, expecting the American aircraft to lock up or tear apart. Instead, something deeply unsettling happened. The P-38 kept accelerating, remained stable, and then, at a speed that should have been fatal, it leveled out smoothly and flew away. In some cases, it even pulled up and came back into the fight. To German pilots, this looked almost unnatural. They had trusted physics, experience, and years of training, and suddenly an enemy aircraft was violating all three. The psychological impact of this cannot be overstated. Air combat is not only about machines, it is about confidence. When pilots believe their aircraft has an edge, they fight aggressively. When that belief is shaken, hesitation creeps in. German pilots began to hesitate before following P-38s into dives. That hesitation was deadly. In air combat, half a second of doubt can mean the difference between life and death. The P-38, with its concentrated nose-mounted firepower, only needed a brief firing window to destroy an opponent. The dive recovery flaps also changed how American pilots fought. Knowing they could safely dive away from danger gave P-38 pilots a powerful escape tool. They could choose when to disengage, preserving both aircraft and experienced pilots. Over time, this contributed to the broader Allied strategy of attrition. The Allies didn't need to win every dogfight spectacularly. They needed to survive, return, and fight again. Germany, already stretched thin, could not afford these losses. As the war dragged on, the Luftwaffe tried to adapt. Intelligence reports began to mention that certain American fighters could recover from dives more effectively than expected. Training manuals were updated with warnings, but by then, fuel shortages, lack of spare parts, and constant pressure from Allied bombing limited what could realistically be done. New German designs like the Me-262 promised revolutionary performance, but they arrived too late and in too few numbers to change the overall picture. In hindsight, the dive recovery flap seems like a small technical detail, but war is often decided by such details. The Germans never expected that an Allied aircraft would turn one of their most trusted tactical advantages into a liability. They never expected that a simple flap could rewrite the rules of the dive, and they never expected that in the cold, thin air, thousands of meters over Europe, a twin-boom American fighter would quietly outdive them, escape them, and slowly help bleed their air force dry. By the end of the war, many German pilots would speak with a mix of respect and frustration about the P-38. It was not always the fastest, it was not the most agile, but it was unforgiving to opponents who underestimated it. The dive recovery flaps were a symbol of something larger, a shift from relying purely on pilot skill and brute force to using engineering solutions to dominate the air. And in that shift, the Luftwaffe found itself fighting not just enemy pilots, but an industrial and scientific system that it could no longer match. If you want to understand how air superiority was truly won in World War II, you have to look beyond famous aces and dramatic dogfights. You have to look at moments like this, when a German pilot pushed his aircraft into a dive, confident in decades of aeronautical tradition, only to watch an American P-38 disappear below him, recover smoothly, and survive. That moment, repeated again and again, is how expectations die and how wars are slowly decided. The first thing German pilots noticed as 1944 dragged on was not just that the P-38 could dive and recover, but that it changed the rhythm of the fight itself. Air combat had always been about forcing the opponent into a mistake, and for years, the Luftwaffe believed that gravity was one of its most reliable allies. Yet now, gravity no longer guaranteed safety. Every encounter with a Lightning carried uncertainty, and uncertainty is poison in aerial warfare. When German pilots climbed to intercept Allied formations, they did so knowing that even if they gained the initial advantage, even if they forced an American pilot to break away, the outcome was no longer predictable. This slowly but steadily altered how aggressively they fought, how long they stayed engaged, and how much risk they were willing to take. As bomber streams thickened over Germany, the P-38's presence became more common. Unlike shorter-ranged Allied fighters, the Lightning could accompany bombers deep into Reich territory. For German pilots, this meant fewer moments of relief. Previously, escorts would peel away, low on fuel, leaving bombers exposed on the return journey. Now, P-38s stayed. They waited. They loitered at altitude, engines humming, pilots scanning the sky. German pilots climbing to intercept Allied formations were already at a disadvantage, burning precious fuel just to reach combat height. When they finally engaged, the fight often ended in a dive, and once again, the Lightning's ability to recover shattered expectations. German combat reports from this period reveal a subtle but important shift in language. Earlier reports spoke confidently of tactical superiority, of choosing when to fight and when to disengage. Later reports began to include phrases of caution, references to unexpected enemy behavior, and warnings about following American fighters too steeply. These were not admissions of defeat, but they were cracks in the armor of certainty. And in war, certainty is often as valuable as ammunition. The P-38's dive recovery flaps did more than save American pilots. They reshaped engagements vertically. German fighters, especially the Bf-109, had excellent climb performance, but were increasingly constrained by fuel shortages and engine wear. Pilots were told to conserve power, to avoid unnecessary stress on their machines. The Lightning, with its twin engines, could afford longer climbs and steeper dives. When German pilots tried to force vertical maneuvers, they found themselves losing energy rather than gaining it. The traditional Luftwaffe hit-and-run dive attack began to fail, not because German pilots had forgotten how to execute it, but because the enemy could now follow, survive, and counter. Over time, this affected pilot morale. New German pilots, already undertrained due to shortened flight hours, were taught tactics that no longer worked reliably. Instructors could explain theory, but combat told a different story. Young pilots learned quickly, often too quickly, that the old rules did not guarantee survival. Many became cautious to the point of passivity, breaking off attacks early or refusing to pursue. This caution, while understandable, further reduced the Luftwaffe's effectiveness. Meanwhile, American pilots grew more confident. The knowledge that they could escape by diving gave them psychological freedom. They could attack with greater boldness, knowing that disengagement was an option. This confidence translated into more aggressive escort tactics. P-38s did not merely protect bombers, they hunted interceptors. They forced German pilots to react rather than initiate. Every dive that ended in a safe recovery reinforced American confidence and eroded German belief in their own advantages. The technical simplicity of the dive recovery flap is part of what makes its impact so striking. It was not a new engine, not a revolutionary airframe, but a small aerodynamic adjustment that addressed a specific problem. German engineers were not ignorant of compressibility, but wartime constraints limited experimentation and implementation. Retrofitting existing aircraft was difficult, production lines were strained, and priorities shifted constantly under Allied bombing. Even when German designers proposed solutions, they often arrived too late to be widely deployed. As losses mounted, the Luftwaffe increasingly relied on ground-controlled interception, trying to direct fighters precisely to bomber formations to minimize wasted fuel and time. But once combat began, control passed back to the pilots, and the same old problems reappeared. A German pilot diving after a P-38 faced a terrible choice: pull out early and risk losing the fight, or continue and risk losing control. Neither option felt like victory. The broader strategic consequence was attrition. The Allies could afford to lose aircraft and still maintain pressure. Germany could not. Every experienced pilot lost was irreplaceable. The P-38's ability to survive dives meant more American pilots returned home, learned from experience, and fought again. German pilots, facing increasing odds, did not enjoy the same luxury. Over months, this imbalance compounded. It was not one dramatic battle that decided air superiority, but thousands of encounters where one side survived more than the other. By late 1944, jet aircraft like the Me-266 appeared, promising to restore German dominance. On paper, these machines could outpace and outdive any Allied fighter, but they came with their own limitations: scarce fuel, inexperienced pilots, and constant Allied attacks on airfields. Even jets could not rewrite the strategic situation overnight. The lessons learned from the P-38 remained relevant. Technology alone was not enough. It had to be reliable, widespread, and supported by training and logistics. In the final months of the war, many German pilots avoided prolonged engagements altogether. They attacked bombers quickly and withdrew. The presence of escort fighters like the P-38 made even this dangerous. The Lightning's concentrated firepower meant that a single mistake could be fatal. And if a German pilot attempted to escape by diving, there was always the risk that the American fighter would follow, recover, and strike again. Looking back, the story of the P-38 dive recovery flaps is not just about one aircraft outdiving another. It's about how small engineering decisions can undermine entire tactical doctrines. The Luftwaffe had built its early success on speed, initiative, and vertical maneuvering. When those advantages eroded, the entire system began to fail. Pilots fought differently. Commanders planned differently. Outcomes shifted. In the end, German pilots never truly adapted to this change, not because they lacked skill or courage, but because adaptation requires time, resources, and stability. By the time the threat was fully understood, Germany had none of these. The P-38 continued to dive, recover, and survive, each time reinforcing a new reality in the skies over Europe. This is why the Lightning occupies such a unique place in World War II aviation history. It was not perfect. It had weaknesses, limitations, and critics, but in one critical area, it overturned expectations. It took a maneuver that German pilots trusted with their lives and made it unreliable. That quiet, repeated shock did more than any single ace or aircraft type to tip the balance. When German veterans later reflected on the air war, many spoke less about specific enemy pilots and more about moments when the sky itself seemed to betray them. A dive that should have saved them did not. An enemy that should have fallen away did not. In those moments, they were not fighting another man. They were fighting a system that had learned, adapted, and outpaced them. And that is the true legacy of the P-38 dive recovery flaps. Not just speed, not just survival, but the slow destruction of certainty. In war, once certainty is gone, defeat is only a matter of time.